Thanks again for everybody joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are right now. Before we get started and I hand the stage to Julian, I'll just tell you a bit more about Salto. Salto is a Salesforce DevOps platform, making deployments smoother and more collaborative. With Salto, you can track and document changes across your orgs, automate deployments with granular control, and understand the impact of changes to avoid issues, and a bunch more stuff. Whether you're an admin or a developer, Salto is here to simplify your workflows, reduce conflicts, and help you deliver faster with confidence. If you want to learn more, feel free to reach out after the webinar or visit our website at salto.io. You can also start a free 30-day trial for DevOps platform. And yeah, that's it for me. So now, without further ado, the man of the hour, Julian.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. So, hello, everybody. My name is Julian Joseph, he, him. I am a lead Salesforce DevOps engineer. You can see a little bit about my background there. Worked with a company called Flaffy previously, who's a Salesforce partner, now owned by GoFundMe. Worked at Salesforce itself.com through salesforce.org. A little confusing there, but it's a nonprofit side of salesforce.com. AgentSync, another partner, and most recently, BOK Financial, that's a Salesforce customer, actually a free agent now, so shameless plug. But yeah, I've been in this space, as you can see, for quite some time, doing Salesforce DevOps um, as a title for the last several years, but even going further back, various DevOps tooling and things like that for these companies, even when I was doing other roles like testing, quality engineer, and end user, things like that. So yeah, thanks so much for being here today. I'm excited to present on a day in the life of a Salesforce DevOps engineer, which of course is me. And yeah, thank you, Salto, for helping partner with me on this. I don't work for Salto, but I am representing, yeah, just what it means to be a Salesforce DevOps engineer, and they helped to make this happen. So thanks so much for that. Also, besides just my Salesforce background, I mentioned on there, I'm a tester of 100 plus smart home products, which is a little jab, I guess, at myself, because I do have 100 plus smart home products on my network, much to my partner's chagrin. Um, all of our lights, doorbells, bunch of cameras, air purifiers, fan, everything is hooked up in different ways. Just as I would say, it's my hobby. I say I'm a tester because it feels like I'm just testing 100% of the time. I don't think a home has gotten to a place where everything just works seamlessly all the time. And so I'm constantly, just this morning, I was resetting stuff. Actually, that's what I was doing this morning, since you asked. I was resetting the smart home so that um, my boyfriend, when he clicks the lights on button, I don't get a evil stare. So yeah, and then you can see I've got a website link here, Julian Social, that goes to my link tree, and you can see my portfolio and other information if you are wanting to connect. I love connecting with people, especially on LinkedIn. Have a lot of conversations there. So yeah, looking forward to meeting you all in various ways. So what are we going to talk about today a bit more specifically? Well, we are going to talk about why we are talking about this. We are going to talk about what a senior Salesforce DevOps engineer is. And so like really getting into this just explanation of what what that means and a bit of the skill set. We're going to talk about the tools as well that a Salesforce DevOps engineer uses as well. And then we're going to go into 4 problems and 4 examples that kind of like day in the life. These are the kinds of things that I face, and it's 4 example solutions of how I actually use some of these tools to solve these problems. And so they're all taken from real situations. And they are, yeah, of course, nothing is proprietary in here, but everything is an example from these real situations that I've come across. Um, Regarding the what is a Salesforce DevOps engineer, like I said, we're going to talk about that today. I would love additional feedback about going into that more in depth. This is a bit more of a practical day-to-day focus, and I did want to preface it with some information about what a senior Salesforce DevOps engineer is, SFDE, if you will. But I could see there being a course or a discussion about how to become one, going into that in more detail. That's not so much the focus today. Today is really more about even more about the problems and solutions and what those actually look like. So why are we talking about this? Well, this is more or less a case for just DevOps in general and the use of DevOps. Excuse me. I have a bit of a cold, so if you see me taking some water in, that's just to help my throat. But yeah, like I said, ops. So right here, I kind of decided to go through what these words mean. I think sometimes we just like take them for granted, or we have like preconceived notions about what they are. I will say these are obviously they're not like the most standardized definitions by any means. This is more just how I think about these words and how I think they apply to the role that I've been doing for some time now. And so first, the idea that everybody has ops on their team. So just any kind of operations, there's a way that you do things, whether it's the decisions you make day to day about how to review code or when to do testing and the order of things. Um, and this idea of DevOps, I would say, is of course adding in this idea of development or developers. Really, it's just the idea of like the engineering team aspect being added into operations. So how does the engineering team, how does the product team, I would say, even a bit more broadly, how do they work? I think of DevOps specifically as like the grease in any team. And so what I mean by that is it's what makes things run smoother, especially I'd say more focused on the technical side, but also going into the people aspect as well, how people make some of these decisions about to doing things. DevOps is really like adding that grease, smoothing it out, making it go smoother. It's already happening on the team, but it's just making it go smoother, saving time, things like that. A DevOps engineer, of course, is just a person who is doing that well. A good senior DevOps engineer is somebody who formalizes this process. And so somebody who takes that maybe to the next level to make it scalable. And then a good senior Salesforce DevOps engineer is, of course, one who does that with the nuances of Salesforce. And for any of those who are Salesforce DevOps engineers, you'll know that there are a number of nuances that go into understanding what good DevOps looks like in Salesforce because of just the differences in how Salesforce is architected with having a separate cloud that you're always talking to and not just everything being local on your machine. So, what is the senior Salesforce DevOps engineer? SFDE, excuse me, like I was saying earlier. So, maybe to look at these terms just a little bit deeper, DevOps again, um, the day to day, or like what does that really look like? It's turning environment creation perhaps into something simpler, like a single click. It's connecting static code analysis tools, kind of like spell check for code. It's automating any repeatable steps. So again, that's like what I'm thinking about with DevOps. With Salesforce, when we're talking about Salesforce nuances, we're thinking about things like even like sandboxes, scratch orgs, those specific nuances that don't really exist in the same way outside of the Salesforce space. Knowing how to work with Salesforce metadata, very important because there's just basically decades of nuances that Salesforce has built into that metadata that somebody who's trying to deploy it or work with it is having to take on, and then use Salesforce specific tools, of course. So like Salto, like Cumulus CI, which we'll be talking about today, some other tools out there. And then again, the senior part of it is somebody who's architecting this to be implemented at scale. Um, and I use senior a bit broadly. There's senior, of course, beyond senior, some companies will have senior lead principal. I'm kind of thinking of it as anybody who's doing something at this higher level. They're probably doing more and more of it. But yeah, they're architecting it. They are also probably thinking even more deeply about taking those technical solutions and balancing them with team morale, productivity, and so making sure that we're not just implementing something just for the sake of implementing it, but it's actually being done in a way that is going to work with the team based on the day-to-day culture of that team. And then it's somebody I would say who also acts like a product owner to a certain degree. I think this is just a necessary part, really, of any DevOps engineer, but especially if you're getting into those senior roles, is you're typically not just doing the work, but you're also managing your own product. And often, just by the nature of DevOps work, it is so specialized to a certain degree that you are likely the only one that knows the like larger value of the work that you're doing. And so you're probably the one prioritizing it. You're the one who's talking to other teammates and kind of researching and getting more ideas for features. You're essentially acting like a product owner of the tooling that you are bringing in. And then the tools of a Salesforce DevOps engineer, I already mentioned a few. And by no means is this comprehensive, but these are the most common ones I would think of. These are the ones I would think of if I was seeing a job posting about a Salesforce DevOps engineer that would be on there, or somebody's resume and the skill set that I would be thinking of. And so it's knowing how to work with a version control. That might come as a given. That's pretty much expected for any engineer, I would say, on a product team. And so that's things like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, um, working with CI/CD tools. And I put YAML in parentheses there because most of these tools, not necessarily all of them, but most of them tend to work with YAML. So it's just usually this idea of knowing how to work with YAML, which is a language basically meant for, I mean, a variety of things, but in this case for scripting and human readability, kind of like JSON, but I'd say even more readable, many would say. But yeah, for these CI/CD tools, what I'm thinking about is GitHub Actions, GitLab, Job, Circle CI, Bitbucket pipelines, AWS code build. You'll notice some of the names are similar or the same, I'd say, as the version control names, because often these CI/CD tools will be embedded in existing version control tools or highly connected to them, or very connected to them. And then Salesforce DevOps tools. So things I'm saying here to build PRs with. That's definitely overly simplistic. You can do a whole lot more with these tools, generally speaking. But yeah, just this idea of essentially taking in some of those nuances of Salesforce and basically connecting them to things like the version control or the CI/CD, and being able to, especially when I say PR building, it's basically I could have also said commit building or merge building, but just this idea of like the way that metadata in particular, is usually extracted from Salesforce and brought over into version control. That's what a lot of these tools tend to help with, and then a lot more on top of that. But that's what I think of as like kind of the core value add a lot of times for these. And so tools like Salto, like I said, Cumulus CI, Capado, Gearset, AutoRabbit, Flowsum, Ute, SRE.ai, some newer tools out there. Yeah, these are the ones that are working with those Salesforce nuances. And I wanted to point out as well, just to notice what's missing from here. And when I say notice what's missing, I'm saying that these are not useful in any way. But I would say these are not necessarily core to being able to do the day-to-day job of a Salesforce DevOps engineer. Typically, every company is different, so that might be more important at certain companies. But generally speaking, when you think of a DevOps engineer, a lot of people, I think about something like Azure or AWS. But for Salesforce DevOps, it's not as common, or not as common to be needed, unless maybe AWS is being used as that version controller or CI/CD tooling. But typically, you're not working in AWS as much. You're working more with the Salesforce org, metadata, and these other nuanced tools, as I mentioned, as well as Kubernetes is just, again, really common on just a general DevOps engineer expectation, but you probably won't see it here as much, if at all. And then I mentioned Salesforce certifications. Again, not to say they're not useful and they don't have their place, but I am proudly not Salesforce certified at all, even though I've been doing it for the last 10 years and I've been able to make a career out of it. It can be great if you have certifications, you can understand the metadata probably just that much more. But in terms of a requirement, I would say until I see at least a Salesforce DevOps certification specifically come out of Salesforce, um, maybe not required. One caveat there, I am talking about like this official Salesforce certifications. A lot of these tools actually do have their own certifications, and so those I could see as being valuable. And so I'm not just saying all certs are bad, but in terms of requirements, it's not as, I would say, common for this type of role. So now we're going to get into the four examples. again, I would just say please do use the Q&A to ask questions as we go through our feedback. One thing I will note, you might have saw this earlier, some of these examples, they might not be, or I would say some of the problems that I'm going to be presenting at first glance, first blush, they might not seem like Salesforce DevOps problems specifically, but I'll explain why. Um, but yeah, would love to get further takes. I'm sure, again, this is not completely comprehensive of every single kind of problem that's out there. But these are some of the ones that I've actually pretty commonly faced at some of the orgs I've been working with. So the first one we're going to talk about is code reviews are slow. Now, this is one that I think a lot of people would think is in the DevOps space, but probably would fall more on perhaps the team lead or the architect or scrum master of a team, which um, definitely it is in their wheelhouse as well to be addressing this issue. But the DevOps engineer, I would say, indirectly or often directly, can have a pretty big impact on how this is solved and how this problem is resolved. And so on the right-hand side here, I'm going to just take you through basically some of the, I guess, beginning steps to either identifying or solving the problem. A little bit more high level, what thought is going into it. That's going to be the theme for these problems as they're brought up. And then as we go through on some of the next slides for each of the problems, I'm actually going to go through a bit more specific solution. I'm not going as far for most of them as doing a full-on demo of providing all the code. Would love to do that at some point, a little bit bigger lift. But you'll be seeing some screenshots of code of the tooling I used, how we how I went about solving this, and again, would love to answer either more detailed questions here or offline later down the line. So again, code reviews are slow. Um, what I've typically done in the past with teams is, well, first looking to identify what exactly is the slowest step. I think a lot of people might default, or a lot of teams might default to thinking, oh, it's the reviewing part of it is slow, specifically in terms of maybe finding the reviewer or moving or them like looking at the code. But often there's other kind of, I would say, other hidden costs in there as well. So it could be choosing the reviewer specifically. So maybe not even doing the review. It could be basically how we are selecting that reviewer. It could be automated. It could not. I've seen people just post on a Slack channel and wait for it to get reviewed. Another part of that code review that could be slow is running tests. And so actually the automation that is running, let's say maybe on every commit for that potential code review, maybe that's the part that's running slow. It could be merge conflicts or what's slowing things down, just because we're having to resolve them, and that's not allowing us to get that code in quickly. And then again, it could be just reviewing the code itself. Um, the next step from there, once you've identified that solution, or sorry, identified the slowest step, then you want to look at designing a solution based on that step. And then you want to test and implement that with the team. I'll say the with team part, I wanted to really highlight, maybe it's obvious, maybe it's not, but when you're actually implementing it, especially in these more senior DevOps roles, really thinking about working with the team. If you're acting essentially like a product owner, you are not just designing and doing this and creating the solution, you are actually working with that team, talking with them, making sure that they actually are able to implement those steps well, that solution. So now we're going to go into an example of what it looks like to have a solution and to go through a solution. So in this particular case, I actually found two solutions. This is, again, taken from real situations that I've worked with. But in this particular case, we identified that the reviewing of the code itself was what was slow, and actually merge conflicts in particular were what was slowing us down. Um, and when I say code reviewing as slow, I'm even thinking of this broader idea of like basically merging code up to the next branch higher, maybe the integration branch. What is slowing that down? And so again, we're finding merge conflicts, reviewing the code. I have actually solutions that we've used for each. And so for the first one, and actually figuring out the reviewing process itself, like what was slowing us down there. We met with the team to discuss the ideal flow. So we heard from the team like what really is frustrating you here. And what we heard back was, oh, when we're reviewing code, there's like we feel like there's like 5 to 10 things we need to do, but we don't remember where to do them or what exactly they are. And it's taking a lot of time to go find the document, to go find out what to do, and kind of like think back and forth. It would be great if we just had that all in line. And so the solution we identified, a fairly simple solution, was really just to update our PR template. So a lot of version control tools, GitHub, I believe also GitLab and some others, they have the ability to just have a template when you are starting when you're starting a new pull request, when you're basically starting a review. And so that's what we decided to update. We went and learned exactly where you go to update this template. And then we just added in a checklist of things to be done. So specifically down here, I think this was like the big request from the team was, hey, we want this checklist of my my code adheres to certain style guides. So I like know to check that when I'm doing a review, perform the review on my own, things like that, making sure that they have actually checked off these steps. And so above is actually what it looks like to change that template in the code itself, the markdown. And then down below, just using GitHub as an example, this is an example of the checklist in an actual PR. So every time somebody creates a PR, they get this checklist right there. It's not in some separate document. They have it handy and they know they can actually check it off. It'll actually allow you to click and check off as they go along. And so that alone, that we saw that increase review speed. The other situation I mentioned, the other problem we identified was again merge conflicts. And so for this, we were finding, in particular, the merge conflicts when we were going from essentially our sprint release to our main release branch, or our integration branch, and merging that up. We had a developer that would do that at the end of each sprint, and it was taking them quite a bit of time to actually do that process because they were getting the merge conflicts of basically everybody below them. They just took this integration branch. It was just their job to merge it up, but they would have to resolve any merge conflicts that were not previously resolved and previously not found on those lower branches. Now, why does that happen? That essentially happens because merging back down is not always happening. Those lower branches are not being kept in sync. And so the developers that are working on them, they don't necessarily know that there's a merge conflict coming. It's not until it actually goes up to a higher branch that that is happening. And so we decided for a solution that we wanted to automate that back merging process. And we wanted to make it so a developer could manually pull down those changes, but you're going to forget to do it. It takes some time to do it, and it just doesn't guarantee that's going to happen. And so this typical way DevOps engineer, that's like music to my ears in a sense. Oh, you're doing a manual process that you don't really want to have to do. You want to focus more on the coding, not this other thing. Okay, that's something to be automated. And so in this case, we actually took CI/CD tooling, GitHub Actions, and paired that with a CLI tool, Cumulus CI, which we'll see more of in a bit. We took those together and automated the process of pulling down those child branches. This is some documentation of what that looks like. As I go through, I'll give a few more examples of GitHub Actions for those who are not familiar, so you can see a little bit more what that code looks like. But essentially, this is the Cumulus CI code that we brought into that GitHub action that we automated with that GitHub action. In particular, this feature, I believe they call it auto merge. It's just like GitHub auto merge or this auto merge feature within Cumulus CI. It basically uses a particular branch naming convention. You can see it in the bottom right. So main feature, lower features, double underscores. You just learn this convention. You implement this convention, this branch naming convention, which everybody probably already has one, but you can kind of customize it to what you need. And then from there, based on the branch names, it basically knows the hierarchy of branches and then will auto back merge down. And the biggest benefit there for us was when that back merge was attempted, then merge conflict was created. So this tool will also automatically generate a merge conflict pull request for the individual feature um, developers branch. And so basically like lets them know, oh, I've got a merge conflict here on my branch right now. I'm in the context to solve this. I know this code. So I can resolve it. It doesn't have to go to another developer a couple of weeks later who doesn't merge and needs to figure out what I've done or ask me about it or make educated guesses, things like that. I can do it basically in context, in line with the issue at hand. So that's an example of some solutions for that slow review problem. Another problem of the second of the four is tests are taking forever. This one definitely, I think at first is like, oh, is this something for the QA team, for the quality engineers to look at, or is it for a DevOps engineer? You think tests, you think equality? Definitely, they're going to be involved. But again, the DevOps engineer, if they are the one creating automation, if they are linking things up to testing, especially, they could be involved in this as well. And I'll show you a DevOps solution to what might be thought of as a QA or a testing problem. So again, the high level solution steps that we looked at is we first work with the product and QA team. So bring in your team, always they are basically your customers in this case as the DevOps engineer. Bring them in, identify exactly which kinds of tests are taking forever. Is it unit tests, UI tests? It's almost always UI tests, but sometimes it's unit tests. And figure out exactly when these tests are necessary to run. I say that because yes, we would love to run every test all the time. That would be ideal in a sense, but it's not ideal in a world of limited time and limited resources. Like we sometimes we have to pick and choose what are the highest level tests to run and what are the most important ones. In fact, coming from the quality testing side, we have a few words for like figuring that out, but one common one is smoke testing. This idea of like what are the tests that are, if there's smoke here, then there's a bigger fire. What are some tests that are like indicating that there could be something wrong? The highest priority ones that we can run pretty reliably and hopefully quickly to give us a decision if we need to run more or if it's a bigger issue. And then once we identify when those tests should run, then looking at when, what are these are some examples of when they should run. So is it going to be on the commit, for example, on merge, on release? There's definitely even more situations, but deciding what is essentially triggering these tests to run and which level of tests, which amount of tests we should be running at each time. So looking at a solution, we identified UI tests are necessary before merge. And so this was basically, again, sitting down with the team and, okay, UI tests in this case, they're taking quite a bit of time, pretty common. Do they need to run before merge? Do they absolutely need to run? Can it be like on the integration branch? What exactly are they doing? Can we replicate in unit tests? In this particular case, it was identified, no, they really, at least for now, they need to run before merge. Like we can't just turn them off and like wait until a merge has happened at that higher level. It's got to happen before a merge on these feature branches. So it's like, okay, so knowing that, good information to have, we decided, okay, let's create a subset of tests, smoke tests, again, these really important ones that can run ideally as quickly as possible or it's as few as possible. And then simultaneously to mitigate the focusing in on tests of the UI tests, we also decided to mitigate risk. We also need to increase our unit test coverage and our unit test count. So it's really strategically looking, if we're like skipping some tests, like what are ways that we can use unit tests that typically run a whole lot quicker to bring those in to essentially replace them and replace that risk to a certain degree, maybe not completely, but to a degree. And then we also decided, okay, we have this smoke test, we have these set of smoke tests. How are we going to figure out how to run them before merge, but also not so often that it's slowing us down? Well, we decided, hey, what if we created a label on our pull requests on these code reviews? What if we created a label to basically say the developer that is creating this pull request, they decide, oh, this is when I'm really ready to merge this. And then it will run all of the tests on every commit. So it will slow us down a bit, but only after the developer has said, I'm pretty much ready to merge this. Because typically what we're seeing is we're basically seeing a backlog, a backup of developers doing their development work as they should be and doing commits. But just a variety of commits, the smaller commits, they're not ready to finish this work. It's just, they're doing their work and they're trying things out or just wanting to save their work. That's reasonable, but we decided, hey, once you're really getting ready to merge this, let's add a label. We figured out a tool, a system with GitHub Actions, this label, and creating a subset of tests to filter those out and have them only run at that time. So here's a screenshot to give you an example of what the solution looked like. Upper right-hand corner, this is just a little screenshot from the PR itself from the pull request, just to give you an idea. We basically create a label that looks something like this: run all tests. By default, you open a PR, it doesn't have this label, but when the developer's ready, they add it to the PR and then it starts running everything. And then to give a little behind the scenes with the GitHub action here, and our tooling for running those UI tests, we were using Robot Framework, which is just one of the testing frameworks that can run Selenium and other kinds of tests. And just in here, just to note, we basically created a parameter that was like smoke. And so we just went in and tagged all of our tests that we thought were the most important with this smoke tag, and then left everything else untagged. And then we just have a basically pretty simple if statement, run these tests with smoke by default. Like these are always going to be run, but only if you add in that label, then run every single test. And so that's what this if statement is doing, this if else is doing right here. Next problem we're going to look at, not enough good test data. And so this situation, again, sounds like quality engineer, but DevOps can be involved. What we did here, we worked with the team to determine what data is crucial and is priority. So again, prioritizing things with the team, and then start to design a solution based on that prioritized data. And the solutions that I've worked with in the past, this is actually a pretty common one that I've worked with at several different companies now. We've decided basically creating that data, we want to make it as simple as possible. And so what we decided is we want to create a one button click solution, or as simple a solution as possible, simple a UI as possible. That was going to get people to be able to create data as they needed it. And so we designed a couple of solutions, as you'll see, a couple of different examples. We thought the simpler, the better. That's going to get people to create data. I'll just put out there bonus points if it's easy to edit whatever solution you implement, especially the data itself, because the upkeep of the data is probably always going to be changing as test scenarios change, as different needs change. And so just making it as simple as possible to update and upkeep by the team, human readable in particular, that's always great. And in this case, we decided to use GitLab jobs and GitHub Actions to solve some of these. And then in terms of the tooling within inside these CI/CD jobs, we actually use Salesforce Composite API, as well as another solution where we use Snowfakery. So take a look at these real quick. So the upper right-hand corner, this is actually an example of using Snowfakery. I think I just have the Snowfakery example, but pretty similar to the Composite API as well. But basically, use Snowfakery. What is Snowfakery? It's a tool that's great for creating fake names, but based on a certain template. So like a fake first name, fake email address, things like that. So it can be good for testing a more randomized set of data, but it's still within certain parameters. You can see in the bottom right, we have like an example of like what one of those Snowfakery files looks like. So you define essentially the shape of your data, and then you just choose how many records you want to run it against, and then you have it run in the org. And so Snowflake is a CLI tool, but as you might be seeing a pattern here, you have these CLI tools that you run maybe locally in your terminal. You put them into a GitHub Action job. You basically created a little product for your team to work with. In this case, I particularly like GitHub Actions for this because it gives you can actually have a UI with parameters that the team can come in and they can just run essentially effectively a bash script, but in this case, it's a GitHub action that is running through all your CLI commands that you've kind of strung together for a particular use case. In this case, it's creating data within an org. And then you, as the DevOps engineer and the product owner of this, you can come in and decide what the parameters are going to be. So maybe it's going to be for different data sets, like loan applications, customer orders. Maybe give them a parameter to choose the number of records. Maybe it's just one that you want. Maybe it's hundreds, things like that. You kind of have that flexibility. So here's an example of like you getting that solution in. Another thing I'll just note, because this has happened several times, I can't tell you how many times I've come into a team, needed to develop a data creation tool. And then as I ask around, I find a developer has created their own tool. That actually happened with the composite API example, which is a REST, part of Salesforce's REST API. Somebody already built all that. And so they already had a way locally on their computer to do something. I was like, why don't we just bring this to the rest of the team and add a few parameters and things like that to be able to more easily use this, rather than you just doing it on your CLI or you doing it. They were using Workbench actually to create that data. Like, let's just move that into a place where it's more accessible to the rest of the team. And then the last example we're going to look at today, and I hope to actually do a quick demo. I say demo, but crossing my fingers, everything goes well there. So it always makes me nervous to do a demo during a webinar, but it's going to go well today. This problem is too many manual release steps. And this was actually, I did a little poll before last week as we were preparing for this webinar. And this was actually the most popular request in terms of learning more. So that's great to know. But yeah, too many manual release steps. Apparently a very common situation. I've also seen it quite often. What I'm thinking about here is especially like you do a release either to your production org if you're a customer, or maybe create a package if you're a partner. And then after that, there's some additional steps after the package gets installed, or even just after the deployment to production. Then an admin's got to go in and click this, and somebody else has got to go run this Apex script and do that and do these other things that just kind of come up as part of any release. I'm going to talk to you about how we've been able to target and solve some of these and alleviate some of the pain here. But of course, first, you actually need to clearly define what a release is. I think this is an important note because people have different ideas of what a release is. Is the sprint ending a release in and of itself? Is it when things are committed to the main branch? That's a release. Is it when we tell our customers? People have different ideas of what a release is. For the purpose of today, I usually prefer and recommend thinking about a release in my mind is when things get into to the main branch. And maybe we should call that a different name than release, but merge to main is often what I've thought of as useful because that can also trigger things down the line, as we'll see. So determine what the release is, and then a few other questions that you can be asking as the product owner of this situation. Are all these steps necessary? So just another thing to throw out there. There's been times where it's like, oh, we do this every time, but maybe we don't need to do it. That's a good way to just simplify how many manual steps you're doing. You just take some out because maybe you don't need to be doing them. And then are any already automated? That's kind of similar to what I was saying earlier, finding things within the team. I've also found devs that have their own like secret Apex script that they run whenever they're the ones in charge of doing the release to production. But not that they're just keeping that for themselves. They just never thought to share that with others, or they never thought how it could be automated in these ways. And so good things to check on. And the solution that I'm looking at today, we decided the merge would be the trigger of the release. And then in terms of how we automated these steps, we found out that a lot of the steps that people were doing manually, they could be just deployable metadata changes through the Salesforce API. So we could, instead of people clicking the buttons, they could just be deployed. And then just another note here, we realized some of the steps they couldn't be deployed because while there's a lot of things you can do with the Salesforce metadata API, there's still some things you can't do. And so for those steps, we also added some UI functionality to be able to actually literally go into Salesforce and click around what people were doing. That's a bit more cumbersome, but that's something that can be done as well if it's not automatable through the API. And so for this example, I want to take through the flow, and I wanted to use Salto because thank you for partnering with me, Salto. I actually was able to like use Salto for this demo, and I want to do a quick demo. But this flow of again getting to release, what it potentially could look like is using a tool, Salto or another tool, to basically pull changes from Salesforce. Again, generate that pull request, and then merge it to your main branch. Again, in this case, we were calling that's the release. And after that merge, we bring in some of the things that I've been using the rest of the webinar: GitHub Actions, Cumulus CI, other tooling to be able to trigger off of that merge. Visually, and we'll do this in a demo, so I'll just go through these quickly, but we have going into Salto and basically creating a deployment, which that again turns into a pull request in GitHub. And then a merge happens, and then we have some of the we have Cumulus CI and some of this tooling and GitHub Actions run some additional steps. Just something to note here. I try to put some reminders for me throughout. A lot of this, I mean, Cumulus CI is an open source tool. You can get a lot of help with AI tools out there. People have different opinions about AI, but I found it very useful, helpful, as long as it's being done ethically. You can get a lot of this. A lot of this can be generated using AI. A lot of this code that you're using, and you as the DevOps engineer, you know what it's doing. You know if it's doing it correctly. But you can generate and use AI in a lot of these situations. And so, like I mentioned, I do want to go into a pretty quick demo here, as long as everything goes well. So in Salto, I'm not going to explain the entire tool and the layout. That's a whole other bigger conversation. But again, just to show you how a tool like this would link up with some of this post-release automation, you could come over here and basically create a new deployment. So this is just comparing and deploying to some orgs that I have connected to Salto. But the nice thing here, you'll see there's also a UI to be able to choose which metadata you want to pull in, compare, push out to that org. But in a second, after this deployment is created, we're going to see how this actually connects to a GitHub pull request. And then from there actually triggers some of these GitHub actions, these post-release steps. So what I'm saying here is you kind of start the release process here, pull in the things you need potentially, and then you move over to GitHub and continue that on with some of the automation. So this should finish in just a second. There we go. So again, I think of this as Salto's kind of version of the PR, if you will, or like their idea of like these changes that you're making. But if you come up here to ready to deploy, view in GitHub, now we can actually see it in our version control in GitHub. And I actually like that it add some comments for you and some additional things. So that's all great. So we basically got this branch out here, which is now compared against my release branch. I'm going to go ahead and merge into that release branch. And what that does is over here in my GitHub Actions, my CI/CD tooling, that has now kicked off a release flow where I have all of my manual steps. And if I click into it, this will probably fail because I haven't fully set this up. But just as an example of how this tooling all works together. Yeah. And so looking back I did just want to, before I wrap things up, did just want to look at this file a little bit more. So I talked about some of these different tasks that we need to do. So it could be running an Apex script. So this is something I've kind of captured within Cumulus CI and again, put in a GitHub action. So we have that ability to run Apex scripts. You could just deploy kinds of metadata, in this case, pick list values, which can be a trickier thing to deploy, I'll say. And then at the bottom here, we just have another example of doing some UI automation within the org. So actually clicking around, maybe enabling something that is difficult or you can't enable through the API. You string all these together, you grow them over time. That's your manual release steps that you're not having to do manually each time. You actually pull them all together who does that? Your senior Salesforce DevOps engineer. So yeah, that was the problems. We had some themes. I know we're getting a little short on time, so I'll go through these quickly. But just a reminder: work with your team. Use things like CI/CD automation. That's another theme, as you were seeing, that can be used to help solve a lot of problems. Um, and it can be connected to these other Salesforce tools like Salto that you're using to do some of like the team management side of it. You can still connect in that automation. And then definitely manage. I recommend managing DevOps projects like closer to a product. Like you are the product owner, you are getting feedback, you are addressing bugs as they come up, you are introducing new features and things like that as you talk with your team. So yeah, that wraps us up today. Thanks so much for being a part of this. Again, would love to hear additional feedback about what other things you would like to hear related to this role, other webinars perhaps in the future, or other ideas. Of course, any questions you have. I'll pass it over back to Baptiste.
Awesome. Thanks, Julian. That was great. Again, if you want to learn more about Salto, feel free to check out salto.io or scan the QR code to learn more and start your 30-day sign up. I also trial, sorry, I also shared the trial link in the chat. Um, and I think we have a few questions, Julian. So I'll let you take care of that. And as
Yeah,
you answer questions, I'll share a quick satisfaction survey. So for the folks that are still here with us, we'd greatly appreciate if you could answer it. Awesome. I'll get back to you,
yeah.
Dylan.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'll go through these in order. I have a feeling we'll be able to get to all of them, but unless some more come in, but I'll do my best. So first one from Erica, thanks so much. Sorry if this was or will be touched on, but do you use any specific observability tools? That is a great question. And when I think of observability tools, of course, we could be talking about observability in Salesforce. I'm guessing that it's about observability of the DevOps processes themselves. Tell me if I'm wrong about that. But if we're talking about the processes themselves, I don't actually use any particular tools other than just what exists in tools like GitLab and GitHub typically, or in the existing tools like Salto, Capado, Cumulus CI in themselves. But in particular, since I am trying to manage like a product, one example is test data creation I gave earlier. I like to keep an eye and actually had like a quick link. It's still in my bookmarks of the uses of that particular job because I like to keep an eye. Is it failing? Are people using it? And it actually tells me, do I need to do a little bit more evangelism within the team? And maybe I need to go do a little, I decided to do a presentation with the QE team, with the business analyst team. This is how you get data in. And the way I was observing how it's used is really just the number of times the job was run, have it's failed. I've seen GitHub itself in particular add, I think, some more tooling for GitHub Actions and how they're being run. And so, yeah, my default right now is just to kind of use whatever minimal tools are in the tool in the existing tool that I'm like implementing the solution in. But yeah, that's what I typically look at. Another one from Nicholas. Julian, how would you indicate for a company that does not have a DevOps process to implement with success? That is a great question because I think that's a lot of companies nowadays, from my experience, is um, not maybe not understanding what DevOps is or wanting it but not knowing where to start. Um, Probably a bigger topic in and of itself, but generally speaking, I personally like to just identify first what do they think DevOps is, because sometimes it's thought of as like, oh, it's just creating this CI/CD tooling, like nothing else. I think of it personally a bit more broadly, as you're maybe seeing with like it's the people on the team working with them, getting this all implemented, change management to a certain degree. And so first, like identifying with them, like, do we understand what DevOps is? Maybe expanding or modifying that definition. And then really going through finding experts out there and other people. There's a lot of consultancies as well that focus in this area, but um, whoever is the right person to actually start implementing these steps. Um, Also, I always encourage, I have a lot of Salesforce developer friends. I encourage them to start implementing DevOps in small ways where they can. It usually just makes their life easier. And so whether that's like automating a little bit more, taking the Apex script that they kind of have tucked away and making it, maybe even just putting it in a folder for the team and making the other team aware. That's to some degree a level of DevOps, I would say. And so encouraging just individual contributors on the team to start adding to it, I think that helps the company as a whole just get better. And at the end of the day, I actually hope everybody is actually contributing to this like bigger use case, this bigger need of DevOps. Artik asks, do clients have a say regarding which tools could be used? Do they have any concern regarding code privacy and code leakage, etc., if any external tool is used by the implementation partner company? Yeah, another good question. So, do clients have a say? Do customers have a say in which tool? Definitely. Just like I would think of like any other tool that they're choosing, they're bringing on, they have a say about how to bring that in to decide what they want to use. And so, yeah, definitely have a say. And then in terms of privacy concerns, yeah, another good question. I mean, I'm thinking about this more broadly. It's just privacy concerns with any technology in general. Usually companies have like a security review process, so thinking about that is really important. I think DevOps tools tend to be in a un somewhat unique place that they need some of the most sensitive data, which is like the code of the company. Sometimes that's the most protected data, so they tend to get extra scrutiny. But what I found is a lot of DevOps solutions do focus quite a bit on security themselves, and so yeah, going through that whole process is important. Being a good DevOps, knowing security as a DevOps engineer also important so that you're aware how you are not just like leaking keys or passwords within these solutions that you're building when you're connecting to Salesforce orgs and things like that. That's another key piece. Ishwarya asks, hi, Julian. Basically, I am a Salesforce admin and trying to move my career towards DevOps side. For that, do I need to have a coding knowledge or to become DevOps engineer and also to become a DevOps engineer and also learning any one tool, Salesforce native tool like Capado or Gearset will leave me in job. So yeah, so in terms of making that I've seen a lot of people make that transition, either admins or developers into DevOps. Like I said, I transitioned mostly from the testing and I would say the admin side over years with my career. Yeah, in terms of do you need to, a specific question was about coding knowledge. Coding definitely can help quite a bit, especially when it gets to like I was showing like GitHub Actions. That's not the only way to do things. There are declarative tools to build CI/CD tooling to a certain degree, but I would say a certain level. You don't necessarily need to know object-oriented programming and some of the more complex design patterns necessarily just to get started. You can really just basically learn basic, what is usually called like basic scripting. Just this code executes an order and does these things. If you think of a bash script, for example, that's another good place to start. So yeah, getting familiar with the terminal itself, highly recommend for making that transition. But yeah, another good way is just to learn, become an expert in a specific kind of Salesforce specific tool, Salto, Gearset, Capado, some of these other ones out there. They tend to, I mean, have a lot more declarative functionality, and so they have their own certifications, which can be good. A lot of them offer that for free, and so I would definitely look into that to learning as much as you can from those tools. And you could, why not just like get a cert from all if you want? I wouldn't object to that. Anthony asks, are these examples available to look at in a repository somewhere? Another great question, and I was actually thinking about that as well. Either a repo or some gists, which are like just single file, essentially GitHub links. And yeah, I'm gonna definitely follow up with me either maybe through the contact this webinar or with me on LinkedIn. I would love to like provide more of that. I did these a little bit more ad hoc for today, and I was a little. Some of them are not fully functioning. They're more like I just want to show the important parts of the code. So I'll have to think about like what that would look like out there, but definitely please follow up with me because I want to get that up there. Another person asked, please share some hand-on link to validate tool ID with capabilities. Yeah, so I mean, well, so there is a link to Salto itself. You can definitely create a trial, and then GitHub is another free tool, and you can always try those things out. Yeah, but yeah, like I was saying earlier, maybe this is about like getting some of the actual work, some of the things I was showing today, and yeah, I would love to provide that in a more detailed way. Pratik asks how to work around those privacy concerns. Yeah, well, there's a lot of ways. It depends on what the specific concerns are. But for example, we're talking about with data. That's maybe one of like PII data, individual user data, and then you think about that. I mean, I was showing one example of using snowfakery, which is a way to just fake a bunch of names based on a certain shape of data. So that's a way to get the benefit of similar data, but with a bunch of not real fake names. And so that can help eliminate some of the privacy concerns. But again, getting I would say good on uh, make yourself knowledgeable about some of the security practices. A lot of these tools they do have secrets, a place to put secrets, which is essentially authentication keys, passwords. GitHub has them, GitLab, pretty much any of these major tools, they have a place to put like a password or something. So getting familiar with how that works. So when you're using a GitHub action, you want to authenticate with something, you can just reference the secret. It's not going to be hard coded into the code. You never want to do that. And so learning how those tools work with secrets is good. Solomon asks, hi Julian, how does your pipeline tackle destructive changes? Oh, yeah, I didn't even. That's a great nuanced question. So I was showing like deploying metadata, but sometimes you might need to delete metadata. Well, I've done that actually in a few different ways. So I believe Cumulus CI has its own, like you can say, just choose a destructive method, and you just have to reference those destructive changes where we're in a folder somewhere in your repo. I've also worked with tools like SFD, which I think stands for Salesforce SGD, sorry, Salesforce Git Delta, which has some functionality to work with that can like at least create folders with destructive changes. And then there's just specific commands you run when you want to run a destructive change. So yeah, you can essentially the short answer is you just add that into the flow, but it does look a little bit different. It's not part of the same deploy. It's a kind of its own separate destructive deploy. Vikram asks, any commonalities do you see between SFDC DevOps engineer role and SFDC quality engineer role? Oh yeah, I mean a lot. Definitely, especially since you're acting as a product manager in a sense, or you're almost acting as the whole team. So I'm testing my own stuff, obviously. So I take over, I take on a lot of that testing part of it. But yeah, I mean, as a quality engineer, I think a good quality engineer is the best representation of a customer. And so having to think like a customer, at least in transitioning my skills and moving those over, I feel like that helped me think about, okay, how do I want this to feel? I was testing as a customer, I had to like represent them. And if something feels awkward or is confusing, I had to tell the devs. And when I was doing that on DevOps side, that helped me think through like, okay, what if I was a developer using my own tool, what would be awkward here? And what a kind of preemptively takes some of that in. That's one of like I would say many things I've done or brought over. And just a couple more. I know we're about at time. Let me know if we need to head out, but I see just a couple more questions right now. So Brittany asks, what made you decide to focus your career on Salesforce? If it wasn't Salesforce, what is another company that you would specialize in? Oh, that is a good question. I kind of fell into my lap, I would say accidental admin style, as they say, where literally the VP of the nonprofit I was working at um, asked if I could learn it, and I just said yes before I even knew what it was. That was actually before Trailhead, and so I had to figure a lot of things out on my own. But just as I've gotten into it, I personally like a lot of the culture of Salesforce. And when I say that, not talking so much about the company as much as even just the people that I'm working with, like here, the different companies I've been working with. Because I feel like there's like a good culture of just sharing knowledge and interacting with people and all of that. So that's kept me in. What would I be doing? What else would I be doing? I don't know. Maybe smart home management. I like Apple products a lot, so maybe doing something with Apple. But yeah, I still enjoy it a lot, and I plan to continue making this my career for as long as possible. And then last question, hey Julian, what's your view on Delta deployment versus full deployment? Yeah, I mean, when I've worked with Delta deployment, so that again, there's a specific tool, Salesforce Git Delta, which is pretty good at you just run it against like a org, I believe, and a version control or maybe just two version. I can't. I think I guess organ version control. I think, and it just like tells you what has changed. That could be really useful because by if you do a full deployment as asked, that's deploying maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, tens of thousands of metadata files. I've worked on teams where deployments would take 30 to 60 minutes easy, if not longer. Um, and so doing the Delta can be really helpful because it'll be a lot smaller. There's always a chance you can miss something. You're kind of relying on that tool, but I've had really good success with it. So yeah, I prefer it whenever I can, but know the differences there between what you could be missing out on if you have any concerns about the Delta. Um, yeah, and maybe very last question here. I got one more. How would you defend yourself if it's when your smart home devices turn on you? Great question. That's why whenever I talk to chatbots or anything in my home, I say please and thank you. You never know about the future. If they're all around me, like you said. Yeah, just try to be nice to everybody and everything. That's how I defend myself against future proof it, if you will. Yeah, I think that's it for questions. Thanks so much for all joining. Baptiste, if there's anything else you'd like to say, but yeah, I really appreciate
Nope,
the time.
that's it. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll follow up with the recording. And I hope you had a good time. I know I did. So thank you so much and stay tuned for other webinars with Julian in the future. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Thanks.